Hello and welcome back. This is our third lesson in ecology. I want to welcome you back from the second lesson where we looked at the edaphic factors: light, temperature, water, pH, nutrients, oxygen concentration, and how each one of them affects the living organisms in the ecosystems. I hope you remember how each one of them affects the living organisms in an ecosystem. So in this third lesson, we shall look at the biotic components of an ecosystem. You remember we defined the components of an ecosystem. We said there are two major ones: biotic and abiotic. So we already looked at the abiotic components. So what are the biotic components of an ecosystem? Yes, the biotic, from the word bio to mean life, it simply means these are majorly living organisms that are found in an ecosystem, and they are categorized into the following. We have those that are called producers, and then there are others that are called consumers. So we have two broad categories of the biotic factors: the producers and the consumers. So let's start with the producers. What are these ones? From the word to produce, it means they are a source. They are at the bottom. They provide nourishment to many other organisms. So these are green plants and some bacteria that are able to manufacture their own food by use of light, chlorophyll, carbon dioxide, and water in the process of photosynthesis. We know that green plants carry out the process of photosynthesis. The green plants and the green algae and the photosynthetic bacteria carry out photosynthesis. And then we have other organisms called the chemosynthetic bacteria. Those ones carry out the process of chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis and chemosynthesis are components, what we call autotrophic nutrition. So organisms that carry out photosynthesis and those that carry out chemosynthesis are the producers we're talking about. Yes, they are the producers because they are the only group of organisms that can fix the energy from the sun into chemical energy. Well, I hope you now know what producers are. So we want to look at the consumers. What are the consumers? These are the organisms which are not capable of manufacturing their own food. So from the word to consume, it means you get food from others. You do not make it yourself. So the consumers get their food by feeding on other organisms. They feed on other organisms or they feed on tissues of other organisms. Those are the producers. So members, we have majorly two biotic categories or factors. We have the producers. These are organisms that are able to produce their own food, to synthesize their own food. And then we have the consumers. These ones are not able to synthesize their own food. Therefore, they get food from other organisms by consuming them or consuming tissues of those organisms. So we can look at that. I visited Kirik River in Kapelebyong district, and I was able to get that beautiful picture. You can see the green plants there and the green algae from the water. Very beautiful. So those ones are they producers or consumers? So what you are seeing there are the producers. The green algae in the water and then the green plants there. Well, thank you very much. I also visited a maize garden in Wanyange, and I was able to see that beautiful scenery those beautiful plants, those are also producers, the primary producers. Great. So let's look at the consumers. After looking at the producers, we look at now the consumers. So consumers are classified into feeding levels. Feeding levels are called trophic levels, and it is based on the type of the food they feed on. So we are going to arrange or categorize organisms basing on the type of the food that they feed on, and we are going to put them in different trophic levels. You can see some of the consumers there. None of them is able to make their own food. You can see, which one can you identify there? I can see the polar bear, the giraffe, the elephants. Well, those are the consumers. So we want to look at the different trophic levels or feeding levels of the consumers. There are majorly 4. Although some books have 5, but for the purposes of for our learning, let's master these 4. The first one is primary consumer. We are going to expound more what it means. Then the second one is the secondary consumer. Then we have tertiary consumer. And then we have the decomposers. So we are going to ask ourselves, what are these consumers? To begin with, the primary consumers. These are the organisms that feed directly on plants. They feed on the producers. Remember, we define producers as organisms that can make their own food. So organisms that feed on plants or feed on producers are called primary consumers. Do you know some of them? Yes, the herbivores are some of them. For example, the cattle, organisms that eat grass and leaves, the grasshoppers, the goats, the sheep, the buffalo, the antelopes, and so on. Those are the primary what? Consumers. What are primary consumers, members? These are organisms that feed directly on producers. Well, then when we look at now the secondary consumer. Secondary consumers are organisms that obtain their food by feeding on the primary consumer. So the secondary consumer feeds on the primary consumer. They are also referred to as carnivores. Of course, the carnivorous animals feed on the herbivores. So they become now the secondary consumers. For example, the cats, the snakes, the lions, and so on. Those ones feed on the primary consumers. So primary consumers feed on producers. Secondary consumers feed on primary consumers. And then we have tertiary consumers. These are organisms that feed on secondary consumers. Yes, and they're usually bigger carnivores. For example, the lions, the crocodiles, the vultures, tigers, and so on. Those ones feed on secondary what? Consumers. And then we have, if there is any organism that feeds on them, they can be called the quaternary consumers. But for now, we have the decomposers. And these are organisms that feed on the dead, decaying organic matter. Remember, the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers all will die at one point, and they will decompose. So organisms that decompose them, that feed on them when they are decomposing, are called decomposers. Yes, and they include majorly the bacteria and the fungi. Decomposers are important because they support in the process of recycling of nutrients. Recycling of what? Nutrients. So members, we now know the feeding levels of consumers. We have the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumers, and the decomposer. So I hope you can define them very well. Thank you very much. We can see from here the primary consumer is eaten by the herbivore. No, sorry, the primary producers are eaten by the primary consumer, which is the herbivore. And then the herbivores are eaten by the carnivores, that are the secondary consumers. And then the lower carnivores are eaten by the higher carnivores, the larger carnivores, which become the tertiary consumers. And all the producers, the herbivores, the carnivores, can be decomposed or can be broken down by the decomposers. So we can also tell that the primary producers are autotrophs. You remember autotrophs? Organisms that can make their own food by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Those ones are the primary producers we talked about. The plants, the green algae, and the photosynthetic bacteria. And then the rest that cannot make their own food are called heterotrophs or consumers. Well, thank you very much. So we can also see from there the levels, the trophic levels there. We have the green plants that are eaten by the primary consumers. Primary consumers are eaten by the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are eaten by the tertiary consumers. So, dear students, in this lesson, we were focusing majorly on establishing the trophic levels of consumers. And I believe by the end of the lesson, we all now know that the trophic levels include the following: the producers or the primary producers, the primary producers, then we move to the primary consumers. Then from primary consumers, then we move to secondary consumers. Then from secondary consumers, we move to the tertiary consumers. In simple terms, the primary producers are eaten by primary consumers. Primary consumers eaten by secondary consumers. And secondary consumers are eaten by the tertiary consumers. So I want you to look at your compound at home and establish these organisms. Do you have them in the compound at home? Can you identify which ones are primary producers in your compound? Can you identify primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers? That is the assignment for you. Thank you very much. We want to wish you we meet in lesson 4. Have a blessed day. Stay safe.